Right, James, thanks for joining me today. It's nice to have you here with us. So this is James Bielby. He is the Chief Executive of the Federation of Wholesale Distributors. So James, we are doing a podcast series, and with this one we just wanted to delve into a bit more about the supply side of the catering industry. So to start off, it'd be great just to understand a bit more about your background and how you've come to be involved in the catering industry.
Well, it's probably a combination of ill fortune and bad luck, I would say. No, I mean, we're a trade association representing the interests of wholesale distributors into food service, but also retail and public sector. So our job is to be a lobby group, in effect. So I'm coming to it from that perspective. I don't have any background as a caterer or any background as a supplier. I did used to work in a wholesale distributor when I was at university, but that was just more of a sort of summer job. So the limit of my experience as an operator, I'm afraid, goes back 25 years or probably more, actually, showing how old I am now. So we are sort of professional representation rather than the actual action of distribution ourselves.
Okay, fantastic. And who, if you don't mind me asking, who have you got as part of your group? Which suppliers are involved with you?
So the wholesalers that we represent, people like Bid Food and Breaks, Booker. On the retail side, we've got Bestway and Costco, but then we have a load of regional wholesalers as well. So the likes of Creed and Savona, Birchill's, some of the wholesale buying groups, Country Range, Caterforce, Fairway, Sterling, operators in Northern Ireland like Henderson's and Linus, and then up in Scotland as well as in Wales with Harlech. So we believe that we are supplying into every postcode every day across the 4 nations of the UK.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Okay. Thanks for that brief background. So just bearing in mind all of the things that have been going on over the last year or so, just wanted to ask, how have you seen suppliers adapting their models, and if you've seen any examples of innovation during this time?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when we went into lockdown 1 back in March last year, some of the wholesalers supplying into hospitality saw that their customer base had disappeared because of the fact that they weren't open. And even then, I don't know if you remember back in those days, a lot of businesses weren't even permitted to be open for takeaway. So it's not like it's been in subsequent lockdowns. So the total market pretty much disappeared overnight. And there was also, alongside that, several challenges for people to be able to access food via the supermarkets because of panic buying, because of a limit in the number of delivery slots for online, and there were plenty of products which were not available because of range rationalisation by suppliers as a result of COVID and restrictions in place with social distancing in production. So at that point, some wholesalers pivoted their offer to supplying members of the public. So we represent those business-to-business wholesalers. Several of them decided that they would utilise the opportunity to sell direct. So things like big bags of flour when people started to, make sourdough at home, which was the craze, if you remember, and then big sort of catering packs that would have been destined for the hospitality sector. That route to market was closed down. We actually, as FWD, set up a website for people to be able to find wholesalers in their local area. So you go in there, put in your postcode, and you could see the offer that was available to you locally. And that was really, really good, and I think very successful. This time around, and the lockdown that we saw in November hasn't been quite as much of an issue because people are able to access food from supermarkets more now. There's no panic buying. There's plenty of products in the marketplace, and the need for those sort of large catering packs has pretty much disappeared. There's still some that is ongoing, but for wholesalers, I mean, it's a nice thing to do to get rid of excess stock, a nice thing to be able to offer to members of the public. But the market is based on volume, so having small amounts of product being sold to individuals is good in terms of getting rid of individual lines, but as a model, it's not really the way that wholesale works. So there was a bit of a pivot into that but primarily the business model has remained the same.
Okay. Do you feel like between lockdown 1 and now, resilience has kind of strengthened within the market? Has it changed, or were we already fairly resilient? It's just, I suppose we've adapted slightly in that time.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that a lot of customers have not been open. So the wholesalers at the same time had to remain open to supply into public sector. So care homes, hospitals, prisons, schools, obviously an interesting one because schools are currently closed. So they've maintained a presence in the marketplace at a loss, trading at a loss because their fixed costs don't go down, but the commercial revenue that they would get from the hospitality industry has disappeared. So there is resilience because they want to maintain a supply of food into vital public services, and doing that without actually making any money from it, and whilst reserves or loans are running out, it shows a commitment to be able to supply food to those who most need it.
Yeah. Okay. So looking forward then, what do you feel the challenges are likely to be as we return to pre-COVID demand?
Well, it's a good question. The assumption there that we'll get back to pre-COVID demand is possibly wrong, or optimistic, I should say. I think we'll probably be at 85% of the market when we get back up and running, whenever that may be. We don't actually know, but I don't think the market will come back to the same extent that it was in say this time last year. So in February 2020, probably be at about 85%. And then what challenges are there associated with that? Well, there are quite a few, because I think, as I alluded to before, the amount of money that's circulating in the supply chain is insufficient to be able to supply into the end user. So if you think about a wholesaler, they buy products from a manufacturer, a primary producer, a supplier on credit terms, possibly say 30 days. They then sell that to a cafe, a restaurant, a pub, who then pay them on credit terms. If those pubs or restaurants don't reopen, or the customers don't come through the door, then they're not going to be able to pay their wholesaler. Wholesaler in turn will not be able to pay their supplier. So there's a credit squeeze, there's a debt squeeze, and also it's very difficult for businesses in hospitality to get insurance against that risk, because the insurance companies probably quite rightly see it as a high-risk industry, given the fact it's been decimated by the measures that have been put in place since March last year. And they don't want to necessarily underwrite that because they think that there'll be a lot of claims. So the government introduced a trade credit insurance scheme last year, so effectively underwriting that risk. But a lot of insurers then choose not to access that or not apply that to the hospitality sector. So there are challenges associated with reopening because the money isn't there at the moment to be able to fund that. It can't be driven by demand, because you need supplies in place before demand picks up again. So that's going to be quite difficult. And we've been working relatively closely with the government in terms of some of the things that we need to enable that restart. And hopefully we're looking forward to the announcement at the end of February and the roadmap to recovery and the reopening of the economy. But I think there are certain things that need to be put in place in order to facilitate that.
Okay, great. So for our caterers that we work with then, what would your advice be in terms of reconnecting with and supporting their suppliers?
Well, have a conversation with us and talk about what they need. So, they're thinking about their restart. They don't know what demand is going to look like. But having a conversation with their suppliers and saying, well, this is what we need. This is the give and take that we need on both sides, because everybody knows there's going to be a credit squeeze. The money's not necessarily there in full at the moment. So, just being open dialogue. I mean, one of the things that wholesalers do really well is working in partnership with their customers. So it's not just about the pure supply of food and drink. It's much more of a sort of holistic, really. So it's a total solution. So things like menus, offering them advice about trends, letting them know about things that are happening in the marketplace to enable them to sell as many products as possible, and give people the food that they actually want and need. So it's about that partnership working really, and I think that has happened. And as I say, we've been there for businesses throughout the last year when they've been closed, but we want to be there for them when they reopen as well. Okay,
fantastic. Great. Aside from COVID, then, we also recognise there are other challenges both in the UK and globally at the moment. Has Brexit had the anticipated negative impact on supply?
Interesting point. I mean, the fact that a lot of the hospitality market is closed would mean that wholesalers supplying into that market haven't needed to access the products that they would have done had they been open. So the impacts haven't necessarily been seen to the extent that they might have been. There have been challenges with the movement of goods from GB to Northern Ireland, because that effectively becomes an export given the Northern Ireland Protocol and the fact that the island of Ireland remains within the single market. So there are challenges associated with that. And one of the things that we've seen throughout the last year is that the government's interventions and their policy and the financial support that they've offered have primarily been aimed at supermarkets and aimed at keeping supermarket shelves stocked. So with regard to Brexit, if the queues build up at Dover, then lorries going into the near continent to pick up goods for supermarkets are able to jump the queue. They get 300 permits that they can use, which is sort of not really fair on those businesses supplying public sector or hospitality. And a similar thing applies with the movement of goods between GB and NI, in that there's a grace period that is currently in operation and may well be extended for supermarket movements between GB and Northern Ireland. So we haven't seen the impacts to the extent that we might have done, but what we have seen is that preferential treatment has been given to a certain part of the market where another area of the market has been neglected, which is a frustration for us. Okay.
So do you anticipate potential further issues down the line as things start to reopen then?
Well, yeah, because a lot of the sort of grace periods, so there are a number of different points in time where things will change with regard to checks, so some in April, some in July, and that will be the point at which the market's reopening. Yeah. So I think the timing of it is not ideal, but we remain to see what the impacts are. I suppose the one benefit potentially in the timings is that things will be able to be produced in the UK across the spring and summer, if we can get people to pick them, of course, which is a separate challenge. So I think some of the impacts may well not be seen to the extent that they might have been. So yeah, it's not ideal, but we wait and see really.
Okay, great, thanks for that. Changing tack slightly, are your members starting to react to the climate change emergency at all? Is that something that you notice?
Of course, yeah, and that's been top of the agenda for many years. If you've got businesses who are operating large sheds which need heating and lighting, and then you've got vehicles which are moving products around, with diesel, clearly there is going to be an environmental impact on that, and they all are working very hard to mitigate those, and then to ensure that they're doing as much as they possibly can to maintain a presence in the marketplace and the needs that are required to be able to deliver food and drink to consumers, but at the same time being cognizant and aware of the climate change emergency. So I think it's about finding a balance really, and where we've been successful is in showcasing the measures that businesses have voluntarily put in place on climate issues, and finding a balance between that and the need for intervention. So things like sort of road pricing will have an impact in London, and is having an impact in London, but at the same time we're aware that there are modifications on vehicles that can be done. Those are being done to ensure that only the cleanest energy is being used.
Okay. And I suppose fairly specifically around packaging, thinking about the climate emergency as well, are you seeing examples of reductions in packaging, and do you support customers with that? So things like returning crates or boxes for reuse, etc., and just generally reducing the amount of plastics that are being used too.
Yeah, and that's been something that's been ongoing for many years. Okay. and we're working closely with DEFRA on things like producer responsibility and the extension of that. There's the deposit return scheme, which is for drinks containers coming in Scotland in the next couple of years. Similar scheme coming in the other nations, maybe 2024. And clearly that's an important part of that process. So absolutely every point in the supply chain is working extremely hard to reduce packaging, at the same time as being aware that products need to be delivered safely, and and finding the balance between the two is the right approach.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, taking a long-term approach to it, not just a knee-jerk, I suppose, is sensible. You mentioned about roads and transport already. So are you also seeing more demand for a reduction in deliveries and maybe a move towards central supplier hub delivery systems?
Yeah, that is happening actually. Yeah. So, and I think that's something that the big cities, so that where there are mayors in place, they're keen for that to happen. Interestingly, one of the things which creates the most problems, not so much maybe now because people are working at home, but when you've got people in cities working in offices, you've got food deliveries going through in smaller vehicles. There's a lot of gridlock on the roads because of because of next day delivery for people's online purchases. So Amazon or ASOS or whatever it might be. That's creating more problems than the business to business deliveries, which have always been there.
Yeah,
that's something that needs to be addressed with regard to hubs. So we know that obviously people aren't in offices at the moment, but when they go back, offices not allowing people to have their private deliveries to their workplace, and then utilising some of the regional networks for hubs for delivery, so people can pick them up. I mean, that it's a sort of something that is an unintended consequence of the need for consumption that people have. They want to buy stuff and they want to buy it immediately and quickly, but that creates problems for business to business deliveries.
Yeah, I guess that's quite an often overlooked challenge there. I hadn't thought of it at all, so it's interesting to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, so we want to be sure that people can be fed, can be watered, and the roads are increasingly busy. It's not private vehicles, cars that people are driving. It tends to be deliveries more so than people driving. If you go into a London or a Manchester or a Birmingham, you'll see a range of different sort of traffic control measures in place through road charging that prohibits private individuals from driving their cars, and they use cycles or walk or public transport, but you'll still see a lot of commercial vehicles, and that it's not business to business. A lot of that is personal consumption.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, lastly then, if you look forward 5 years, what change, if any, would you like to see in the industry?
It's a really
quite a big broad question there for you.
My days of crystal ball gazing are probably behind me, given that if you'd asked me 18 months ago where we would be now, I would never have predicted a global pandemic, which caused the economy to close down for 12 months at least. So, the unknown unknowns, if you like, putting those to one side. Well, we've definitely seen a trend towards online and online ordering and purchasing by caterers. That will continue. That will only go in one direction. But I think we're also seeing a trend towards, which has probably been increased by the events of the last year, much more sort of localism. So, people more interested in food provenance, but more interested in how the food that they're eating, A, where it's come from, and B, how it got there. I think that's a really, really positive development, and that we've seen that across the last year, and I think that will probably accelerate now as a result of the way that people have started to think about things in a different way. Nothing is without consequence with regard to consumption, and the climate emergency is much more front and center of people's minds now. It's interesting to think that the measures that have been put in place for the pandemic, had these similar investment been made against tackling the climate emergency, we would have, it's as much an emergency as the pandemic, but the same level of funding and attention hasn't been given to it. And I think that will be the next challenge. So that's the next crisis that we're facing into, and we all need to be aware of that.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, James. Really appreciate your time. It's been really good to talk and get your perspective on things. So,
thank you very much.